The First World War is often portrayed as Britain fighting a German empire, keen to expand by military means. But both countries had their eyes on one part of the world, which had strategic and economic importance then and now, the Middle East. In this episode of The Great War, A War to End Wars, we talk to two experts about how the First World War impacted on the Middle East. Dr. Jamie Allinson of the University of Westminster and Florence Gaub of the European Union's Institute for Strategic Studies, both of whom have written extensively on the subject. Jamie, what were Britain's strategic concerns in the Middle East?
Well, it was a time of transition, so the old strategic concern was really the trade route to India into the east. So Britain had placed naval bases, all of you like the choke points of the naval route, the sea route to India through the Mediterranean. That was still a really key concern. The Admiralty was very powerful, and that was how they looked at the world. But the British Navy and armed forces in general were changing over at this time to use oil as fuel. And also, oil had begun to be discovered, just started to be exploited in Iraq and in then Persia. That was also beginning to be a strategic concern for Britain. So it was, if you like, a time of change.
What were the strategic concerns of both its opponents and its allies?
So in the case of the opponents, Germany was very keen to tie the Ottoman Empire and then the oil fields of what is now Iraq and Iran into its sphere of influence. And so it had been trying to build the famous Berlin to Baghdad railway. So there was a direct competition there. The French, on the other hand, were probably more concerned about preserving their North African influence. And for them, what we call, or what was called in the Levant, was something more of a kind of side issue. The Russians wanted to get access to a warm water port, and so had a long conflict with the Ottoman Empire in the region.
Was oil already important in how the great powers viewed the Middle East?
No, there's no truth to it, because in 1916 there was a little. It's true that during World War I the powers recognized that oil would become more and more important. But in 1916, the only place where oil had been discovered in the broader Middle East was in Persia and Iran, and there were some suspicions that maybe around the Persian Gulf there might be oil, but nobody had discovered it yet, and nobody actually suspected that there was as much as was later discovered. What is true, however, is that, of course, Britain had an intention to control the Middle East, not for oil, but because of the trade routes. If you look at the map, you'll see that Britain is was connected, or still is, to India via the trade route that goes through the Mediterranean, and then the Suez Canal, etc., etc. And what's interesting about this trade route is that it's not only a vital one, not just for Great Britain, but Europe in general, but also it's a very vulnerable one, because it has 5 choke points that can be closed off easily. You still hear in the press today about the Strait of Hormuz being potentially closed off, what the impact by Iran, exactly the impact that would have on Europe. But there's Bab el-Mandab, then there's the Suez Canal, of course, which has been closed off actually on several occasions. Last time, I think in '67, by Egypt. There was a huge economic impact on Great Britain in particular. Then there's the Dardanelles and Gibraltar. So controlling this region, which is incidentally also the neighbor of a very important trade route, was in the interest of Britain ever since the Suez Canal was opened in 1869, I believe.
Britain, during the First World War, promised the Arabs the creation of a pan-Arabic state, the Jews a Zionist home in Palestine, and meanwhile they were partitioning the whole region between themselves and France. The three things were in total contradiction, were they not?
Yes, they were. Some people would argue that's not the case, that, for example, Sykes-Picot and later San Remo agreement gave a perfect position, a place where you could have an Arab homeland. And that this, in fact, was taken up by the descendants of Sharif Hussein, who led the Arab revolt to try and take over Syria, unite Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. But it should be noted that the French put a stop to that very quickly when there was the Arab revolt reached Syria, the famous Battle of Maysalun. The French, if you like, quashed that. So those interests are clearly divergent. And in particular, the Hussein-McMahon correspondence is contradictory to, in impression at least, the Balfour Declaration. So Balfour's promising quite explicitly a Jewish homeland in Palestine. As far as the Arabs were concerned, there would be an Arab homeland, and that this was the impression they got from the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. Now, you could argue that the text itself is not explicit on that point, but the way diplomacy works, and especially the way that British diplomats of the time worked, they were aware of the implications of texts.
Yes and no. I think you must not mistake the British government for a cohesive bloc. I mean, even today it's not a cohesive bloc. It wasn't then back then either. The British side, the military side, was pulling into one direction. What Lawrence did in the Hejaz with the tribes was actually an operation that at the time nobody thought was going to be very successful. The other thing is that Balfour was later taken back by certain elements of the British government. I think everyone agreed that control of the Middle East was important, but nobody really agreed on how to get there. So there are these different dimensions that are pulling into different directions. And don't forget that this is also a wartime scenario. So what Britain offered, what McMahon actually offered to Sharif Hussein, parts of Syria, he couldn't actually, because the Sykes-Picot Agreement promised Syria to the French. So there's also a lot of promising whatever doing in a wartime circumstance just to get the war done, and then we'll talk about what happens afterwards.
Why did Britain back the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine?
Well, there are a number of interpretations for this. In one sense, one argument is that Britain wanted to have a permanent strategic presence in the region. That's certainly true. Whether that would have been achieved by a Jewish presence it might be questionable. I mean, it creates its own problems that then probably makes for a more difficult life than not having it. But there was certainly an element of sympathy towards, if you like, European settlers as against the natives of the region. And also a kind of ideological commitment to Britain identifying with Zionist interests. So for a long time, the outside powers, Britain and France, had tried to pick religious minorities that they could play off against the Ottoman Empire. Britain, for a long time, finding not very many Anglicans in the Middle East, looked towards people like the Druze, but increasingly the Jewish community, the Yishuv. Also, there was the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution can't be underestimated, or the impact of kind of socialist ideologies and the idea that the Jews, essentially an anti-Semitic notion that Jews were involved in world conspiracy against imperial power, and that somehow if you offered them this part of the world, they would cease their nefarious doings. It did actually exist in the British ruling class at the time.
How important was the Arab revolt to the war in the Middle East?
Not that central. I mean, no, Britain would have won without it, probably. But, and this reflects Lawrence's famous description of it as a sideshow, but it definitely weakened, it distracted the Turks at the time. And the places that they came up through, so it came up through a very old trade route and the kind of Hajj route up through, I mean, it's essentially the route that the original Muslims took to that area. That did inspire a lot of people. And what it had the effect of doing was bringing to that side, if you like, Arab officers who were in the Ottoman army, I mean the so-called Istiklali, the independentist forces, who were to become very important in the later formation of these states. They were often relied upon to be the administrators.
Is Sykes-Picot to blame for the Middle East's problems today?
Well, the first thing is that the troubles that you have in the Arab world today, especially in the Middle East, are not, in my opinion, ones that are created by the states as such as they have been more or less created by Sykes-Picot, but because of a crisis of trust between the citizens and the states as such. So simply put, Arab states don't trust their citizens and the citizens don't trust their states, which is a situation you find today in Syria, etc., etc. What many people think is that because these states don't manage their borders properly, like Syria, I mean, can't manage its borders, or Lebanon or Iraq, that the state as such has failed. So that confuses statehood with its border management, essentially. That's too simplistic. That's point one. The second point is that the states as they are have existed on average, well, on about 60 to 80 years if you include the colonial period, and that's quite young in statehood terms. So a little bit of trouble in the beginning is actually quite normal. To blame everything on the admittedly arbitrary division of the Middle East with Sykes-Picot, or rather the Lausanne Treaty that followed it, is too simplistic, because it doesn't look at the real causes of the troubles we have today. What are the troubles that we're actually having, and how can we get out of it?
Probably overstating it to lay the blame with Sykes-Picot. I mean, we're already 100 years or nearly 100 years on. What you can do is say that the trajectories of the states formed out of the principles behind Sykes-Picot, because it's true to say that the actual lines drawn on the map are not those that come out later. That does happen in the San Remo Conference and so on. But the principle that, first of all, the Western powers dispose of this area as they wish, and then that the states that they build up they have to support in some way and find local allies. We can see the trajectories of current events in that process. So, for example, I mean, most obviously, there's the partition of Palestine, historic Palestine, but also the seeking of local allies by the French in the form of bringing in some of the religious minorities, national minorities in Syria, which gave, in particular, the Alawites, who were a quite oppressed, I mean, to this day, quite poverty-stricken group, a route to social mobility, which is in some sense related now to the strong desire of that regime, which has at its heart an Alawite family, to hang on to power.
Britain and France very quickly faced resistance in their new colonies of the Middle East. Can you explain?
Well, across the region, there were anti-colonial revolts, as I say, in some senses before there was even a colony. So the principle behind the League of Nations establishing mandates was the idea that these areas were not fit to rule themselves. They hadn't asked the people who lived there what they thought about that. And it was pretty clear what they thought, which was that in Syria there is this uprising which continues, actually, in various forms, in some cases similar patches of geographically resistance to what we see happening today. Even in Jordan, there were some revolts, especially in Iraq. There was a massive, massive revolt across communities as well, across Kurds, across Shia, across Sunni. And then the famous revolt that brings Egypt its semi-independence. So in trying to extend its empire, Britain actually begins to experience, and we have to remember this is the time of the Irish rebellion, which led to the founding of the Irish Free State. Britain is actually beginning to lose it, if you like.
Promises, I think today we're not used to the fact anymore that states actually make promises to each other and later don't live up to it. It's a much more transparent world today. And don't forget that Sykes-Picot only became public because Russia had just undergone its revolution and the communists decided to open the archives. So if it hadn't been for a communist revolution, we would never know about Sykes-Picot. So the promises that Britain made, it handed out promises left, right and center, and I think so did France. Everything that would help the war effort was actually, in the short term, considered allowed without actually long-term strategic planning. And that's why it's important to understand that the British government itself was not cohesive. There was disagreement of what could not be done, what might make sense in the long term. The First World War, although it's today overshadowed by World War II, was a very critical junction for many European states, and particularly for Great Britain, who had to redefine itself. I think for all the European states, all the states that were involved in World War I, for Great Britain, there was a lot at stake. Had it lost the war, the whole empire was at stake. I think that was not the same for France, and definitely not the same for Germany.
How did the Versailles Treaty come unstuck so quickly in the Middle East?
Yes. So with the end of the Ottoman Empire, which you have to remember is a very long-standing institution, a very long-standing authority, its collapse, it was a vacuum in a lot of places. You see that in the contest for power in Syria, you see that in what is now Jordan, which was effectively ruled by local figures for several years. But in the case of the heartland, the Anatolian heartland, which is quite a settled area, a distinct linguistic group of the Turks who were identifiable as a majority. Very many Christians, though. I mean, people forget that there were a lot of Greeks who were expelled at that time. Ataturk, a charismatic figure with military resources, was able to, in some ways, fight one of the first anti-colonial wars before there was a colony. So Britain and France were quite concerned even to take the bits of Anatolia, or bits of what is now Turkey, and in alliance with the Greeks. Ataturk was able to defeat them, and that put kind of a spanner in the whole works.
Are today's Arab states artificial?
Well, first of all, there are two schools when it comes to state building or nation building. Or if you prefer, let's call it the chicken and the egg school. The egg school says that a nation creates a state. So you have a group of people who decide, we are a nation, we want to have a state, and from there they create the chicken that comes out of the egg. The other school that I adhere to says, no, actually, there's a chicken first that then creates the nation. A good example is France after the French Revolution, or Germany after German unification. In Germany in 1871, you would have plenty of Bavarians who didn't consider themselves as German, or in France, in the regions, in Languedoc, for example, they didn't consider themselves French after the French Revolution. So the state actually created a nationalism that then created the nation, and that we today, 200 years later, or 100 years in the case of Germany, created the nation as we know it. So it's a bit a push and pull situation. It's neither nor, but it's too simple to say that an Arab state would have been born out of the will of the Arab peoples to have one state. Of course, there was an Arab push to have a state, especially around what is today Syria, Greater Syria. That was actually what the Arabs had negotiated in the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. They wanted a state including Hijaz, which is today part of Saudi Arabia, what is today Jordan, and then Bilad al-Sham, meaning Greater Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, the north of Iraq, actually. And that promise was broken. But that doesn't mean that the state that the Arabs had in mind would have worked. It doesn't mean that Hussein was actually negotiating on behalf of the local constituencies. It doesn't mean that this would have been born out of a locally grown nationalism. So it's true that there was this ambition, but does that necessarily mean that the state that would have been born under these conditions would have been more viable than the states we have today? I just doubt it.
How important was Pan-Arabism?
One thing that's often overlooked is the fact that at the same time as, shortly before World War I broke out, in 1913, there was the first Arabist Congress in Paris, actually, which shows that Arabism as a political force was emerging. The fact that it happened in Paris actually has a reason, because the French tried to channel it. They saw this emerging political force and they wanted to control it. Now, what's interesting is that who called first for a pan-Arab state was Sharif Hussein of the Hijaz, but the ones that were present at the Congress in Paris were mostly from Beirut, actually. So this is where Beirut, Damascus, where these intellectual circles started calling for a pan-Arab state indeed. So Ba'ath Party, Nasseris, I mean, there were different branches of Pan-Arabism, but the point is that there was indeed a political movement that wanted to create something bigger that was detached from the Ottoman Empire. There was a very anti-Ottoman movement, actually, Pan-Arabism originally. And the Europeans tried to seize this political movement to their advantage. And that's why Great Britain promised a potential Arab state to Sharif Hussein, because he knew that that was something he could actually surf on if you want. But that doesn't mean that Hussein was actually a pan-Arabist. He had his own ideas of what he wanted to achieve, and it was certainly at odds with what the pan-Arabists from Beirut and Damascus wanted. So it's true that the Europeans, France and Great Britain, have successfully divided the Arab world. That doesn't mean that what was in the second row, that was what the Arabs had actually planned, would have been more successful, because amidst the Arabs themselves there was a lot of disagreement of how and where state formation would go.
Can the Arab states succeed?
Give the Arab states a bit more time to establish themselves. The crisis of sovereignty that you have, the fact that these states need to consolidate themselves to the inside, that they're not stable enough to protect themselves against foreign influence, that plays a huge role in their fears, and hence this violent relationship between states and citizens. I think from a political scientist's point of view, that's probably fairly normal at this early point in time. But of course, we live in a fast time. We don't have time anymore for states to establish themselves sovereignly.
In our next episode of The Great War, the war to end wars, we shall look at the troubled legacy of perhaps Britain's greatest war hero, a man who fought his war far from these trenches in the Western Front, Lawrence of Arabia.